Hi everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 21st, where we are putting some closure onto our short story unit. If you'll note on the syllabus, today is catch-up day, and I intend on catching up by finishing up our last two short stories that are very short indeed. The first entitled Girl by Jamaica Kincaid, and the second entitled Popular Mechanics by Raymond Carver, which would mean that this would be the time that you would be handing in your first journal. According to the syllabus, the journal would be due today on the 21st at 11:59 p.m. And I ask that you send that to me via PDF to my email address, which is Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu, because that's how my grading program works best. And then I will review it informally, not reading it for grammar or mechanics, just for content, as if we were having a conversation on paper. And using a checkmark scale, with the plus being excellent and a check plus being very good and a check being satisfactory. That's where most of the grades range. There is also a lesson satisfactory and unsatisfactory. And basically, what I was asking is that you choose three short stories from the short story unit. Obviously, we've read more than three. And that you respond to each of those short stories in about a page or so. So that would mean a total of 3 pages probably for your three short stories. You can talk about the short stories as individual units, but you can also talk about the short stories together if you'd like. And the idea behind the journal is that it's a place for you to write down observations and questions and comments, more than just plot. And again, it can be very informal. It could even be a series of bullet points if you so wanted. But hopefully this will help you formulate some ideas about what you could pursue with the paper, which is something that we will be talking about over the next couple of classes. But we are beginning with the informal journal assignment. That said, since I didn't finish the journal, or I didn't finish the short stories in time for the journal due date, I'm going to be giving you an extension for the journal. So now you've got, as you can see in the notes below, up until Thursday, and that would be Thursday at 11:59 p.m. Via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. So certainly you can hand in your journal now, but if you wanted to wait until Thursday because you wanted to have all of the short stories to choose from, then certainly you could do that as well. And in terms of the two short stories that are left, Girl and Popular Mechanics, you'll note that in the notes below for Girl, which was written in 1978 by Jamaica Kincaid, an author from Antigua, that I actually was able to find Jamaica Kincaid reading her story, which reads very much like a poem. So I would ask you to click on that link, which is approximately 4 minutes long or so that you could hear her read her piece. And what we have is a mother that basically is speaking to a daughter. We aren't given very much information, but what we get are a list of rules and expectations for female in 1970s Antigua, but it also is pretty relevant for the United States and also pretty relevant for our own time period in many respects. You'll notice that many of the duties that seem to be quite obvious, the cooking, the cleaning, the caretaking, interspersed throughout them, there is the command to not be the slut I know you're so bent on becoming. And certainly this leads to the tone where the mother is quite harsh and is quite domineering, but it also illustrates the importance of sexual purity for female during this time period. In fact, even in our own time period, I think about 2 words to describe sexual activity. One comes with a much more negative connotation than the other, and one is associated with the male gender and one is associated with the female gender. And in fact, they both begin with the same letter, S. And those 2 words are slut and stud. And slut is usually associated with the female in a negative way, and stud is usually associated with the male in a positive way, and that's in 2023. So we have this mother figure that basically is trying to teach this girl what it is that she needs to do in order to gain respect and also a certain level of privilege within society. Because ultimately, the last line is probably the most important piece about squeezing the bread. And that can be literal, but it can also be a metaphor. And then, how can you gain access to that which you aren't supposed to have access to? And the assumption is that as long as you play by the rules so that society thinks you're being a good, quote, girl, unquote, then you will have access and privilege to things you normally wouldn't have. And in fact, in some ways, this reading is subversive because the mother suggests things to the girl that wouldn't be necessarily associated with female purity. The mother tells a girl how to rebel by spitting in the air, or perhaps more importantly, how to make a medicine to throw away a child before it even becomes a child. So now we're talking about abortive techniques. And again, that seems to be in direct contrast to the idea of the slut. I know you're so bent on becoming. But again, if the mother is giving the girl rules for survival within society, then the mother is also giving the girl opportunities for exerting a certain level of power in a society that disenfranchises her. And this said, I one of the reasons why I love to give this particular reading is because of the style of the writing. It sounds quite poetic, as you heard if you listen to the Jamaica Kincaid version. Also, you might have noticed that it's mostly one long sentence. It's just connected through the use of semicolon. And this, I think, is very important in terms of understanding how the author is using punctuation to reinforce theme. That a semicolon is not a complete stop. It's a long pause, in effect. A complete stop should be a period. So there should be periods after each of these sentences or each of these independent clauses, which is just another way of saying sentence. But by using the semicolon, what Jamaica Kincaid is basically saying is that there is no time to stop between all of these tasks. They are never ending. You know, I've always said that in order to truly read this piece and the way that it was written with the use of the semicolon, you'd have to do it in one long breath, something that not even the author herself can do, as you see with and hear with her presentation. But I think that's very illustrative of some of the themes that we talked about at the beginning of the semester. For instance, a sorrowful woman, a wife and mother one too many times. And I think the same sorts of themes are echoed here, except, of course, embedded within this text of how to follow rules. And notice that the girl tries to speak twice, and at first the mother ignores her. The first is that the girl says she doesn't sing Benna in Sunday school, which would be, in church, this would be considered to be inappropriate. But the second question, the more important, but what if the baker won't let me squeeze the bread? And then the mother's response, you mean after all I've told you that you'd be the kind of woman that the baker wouldn't let squeeze the bread? And if you follow the rules, the baker or the person in power will give you access to do things that other people don't. It doesn't escape me that bread is oftentimes used as a slang term for money, and of course, race and economics go hand in hand, and socioeconomic issues go hand in hand. So in terms of thinking about Popular Mechanics, which was written by Raymond Carver in 1981, Raymond Carver is known for minimalist writing. We've seen some attempts at minimalist writing, or at least at writing that tends to be shorter and more concise, with, let's say, Ernest Hemingway's style and Soldier's Home. But Carver took it to an extreme with the minimalist writing. And, of course, thinking about the titles, Popular Mechanics. In fact, the original title for this story, which is included in the questions at the ending of the story in the text, which I had assigned for class. The original title was Mine, which probably makes a lot more sense based on what's happening within the story. But Raymond Carver changed it to Popular Mechanics. I'll talk about that in a moment, or some of the possibilities why. But even think about the title Girl, and imagine if this piece were entitled Boy and we were to get a list of rules from either a mother figure or a father figure, and how might that change the dynamics about how a male needed to be able to integrate himself within society in order to gain access and power. And that said, obviously it's a different dynamic for the female, especially in Antigua. But and many of the references in Girl are about Antigua themselves. So what we're talking about, issues like singing Benna, as I was referencing earlier. But that could work just as nicely in terms of perhaps singing popular songs in church rather than church hymnals. But for Popular Mechanics, I hope that you notice that what we've got is a series of dialogue between an arguing couple, yet there is no use of quotation mark. I think that's quite important. We usually use a quotation mark in order to give credit or acknowledgement to the person who is stating that particular language. And I would say that their statements are so generic, so universal, so popular, hence the title Popular Mechanics, that there really isn't any need to give any kind of acknowledgement for direct quotation. That this is the usual dialogue that occurs when a couple is splitting up. I use that term deliberately, splitting up or breaking up. I'm glad you're leaving, you son of a bitch. I use the use of profanity there. I'm glad they're arguing. First, they argue over the picture of the baby. A picture is a physical object. Obviously, if they were to try to split that picture, it would ruin the picture. Keep that in mind. And then as they continue to argue, it's about the baby itself. The baby's referenced at one point as it, a possession, a thing, a way to exert power over the other party. We're never told what they're arguing about because it's unimportant. That the message of this particular piece is that it's not that one person is right or one person is wrong or one is justified or one is not justified. What matters is the welfare of the child, which is clearly being ignored as this argument continues. They go into the kitchen, which is oftentimes a room that's associated with family and safety, but they knock over a flower pot. And again, this idea of something that's live that they destroy. The tone is set right from the very beginning when we're told that it was getting dark on the inside too, in addition to getting dark outside, and that there was snow that was turning into dirty slush. So again, all of these references through the dirty shoulder high window. Again, this is very different than the kind of window Mrs. Mallard would have looked through in Story of an Hour, which gave a very different kind of tone. They're holding the baby over the stove in the kitchen, and the baby is wailing and screaming. Obviously, this is a place of danger, holding a child over a stove. And as the child becomes red-faced and is screaming, both parents ignore the child. Obviously, the child is in distress. And at the very ending, it says that both parents are pulling on the child, and in this way, the issue was decided. And the ending, it almost reminds me of Rose for Emily. It doesn't explicitly tell you what happened, but it's pretty obvious if you have two adults who are pulling as hard as they can on an infant, that what they do is they split that child. They kill that child. Think of something like a wishbone. And this story is actually a modern day takeoff of the story of Solomon from the Bible. So oftentimes understanding the Bible from a literary perspective is very useful for understanding literature from a academic perspective, because oftentimes literature will use the stories of the Bible. And in this story of Solomon in the Bible, two women go to King Solomon, and they both claim to be the mother of a child. And Solomon wants them to settle the dispute amongst themselves, and they're unable to. So Solomon, in frustration, says, well, since we can't come to a conclusion, I'll just split the child in two, and then each woman can have half of the child. That would be the fair way to resolve this dispute. And the biological mother steps forward and says, no, give the child intact to the other woman. And then Solomon says, well, you must be the real mother because you would be willing to sacrifice your child, or you would be willing to sacrifice yourself for the benefit of your child. And that's the lesson that's taught in that biblical story, that a parent would put their child's welfare above their own. In this story with Raymond Carver, we get the exact opposite, which is something that perhaps has become rather commonplace. Again, in America, where 50% of marriages end in divorce, where neither parent puts the child above themselves, and ultimately the child is the one who suffers. And hopefully the child isn't physically killed, but children are emotionally split every day in the battle of divorce. And sometimes even are split geographically in that they have to live in two homes at the same time, which is no easy feat. Again, this is something that's become rather commonplace in our society, but certainly less so at the time in which this story was written. So in some ways it was a cautionary tale about some of the negative consequences of divorce. And if you know one of the definitions of mechanics, it's that it's about two forces working against one another. And that works very nicely in terms of what's happening in the story with this arguing couple. And also, you may be familiar with a popular magazine that is called Popular Mechanics. And it's a kind of a DIY magazine about how to fix things and make things. And of course, this story almost sounds like a set of instructions on how to break something apart and how to destroy something. So there's some irony there as well. So I obviously the title Mine is fairly clear as to what happens in the story, and that both parents view the child as a possession and see it as theirs. But I think Popular Mechanics requires the reader to think a little bit more. So I actually prefer the title Popular Mechanics. It's just a personal preference. It was the title that ultimately the author decided on. So with these two short stories, we end our short story unit. That's not to say that there aren't many more short stories that we can examine, because there are. But we need to move forward, which means that we will be transitioning over into drama. And that will be over the next several classes, talking about what drama is and how to read drama and how to write about drama. We also need to talk about how to write a paper, because eventually, after you hand in your first journal on short stories, you will have a paper due about short story, where I'm asking you to pursue a theme or an idea. If you remember, I had given you some sample paper topics a couple of classes ago, and they're in the syllabus and other documents folder. But you can certainly come up with your own paper topics. So you might want to use the journals as a way to examine ideas for possible paper topics. The paper would be an in-focused analysis, and grammar and mechanics would be as important as content, and it would be evaluated on a formal letter scale. But everybody has the option of rewriting that first paper for a higher letter grade if they so chose. So you could think of the first paper as a kind of draft. I will evaluate it and give it back to you with the letter grade. And if you're content with your letter grade, you're done. But if you want to earn a higher letter grade, I ask that you do a revision, taking my comments into account. And if you still need further direction, we can always meet and I could give you some more suggestions. And that you hand in the revision along with the original evaluated copy from me, so I can compare and contrast the two. And you would get the higher of the two grades, which is really the way that professional writers write, is that they go through multiple drafts and they go through multiple edits, and they oftentimes have quite a bit of feedback. So Since we're still in the beginning stages of how to write a paper, I think this makes perfect sense if you're not exactly sure. Though, if you'll remember at the beginning of the semester, we talked about, or the text talked about some techniques that you could consider in writing a paper. I'll also have a handout that I'll be sharing with you next class, talking a little bit about how to construct a paper. I also wanted to tell you that when it comes to the dramas, we are reading only three, but those three dramas are much longer than any of the short stories, so that we will be spending multiple classes on each drama. The first being Oedipus the King. That happens to be from 430 BC in Greece. So we'll talk about some of the reasons why this play is still read and why it's so important. And then we'll move to Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare, from the 1590s, and we'll talk a little bit about what A Midsummer Night's Dream is about and what a Shakespearean comedy is about, which is what A Midsummer Night's Dream is. It's a comedy. I want to try to lighten things up by this point in the semester. And then finally, we'll end the drama section with A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry, a much more contemporary piece from the 1950s from the United States. So I think you'll find that to be a much easier read. That said, all three dramas are important, not just for their historical period, but they're also important in terms of some of the literary elements within them, as we'll talk about. And drama ultimately is meant to be performed. So I did want us to spend some class time watching performance as well as talking about drama, which is why we've got about a couple of weeks devoted to each drama. That said, what would be ideal is that when we begin to talk about a drama, you would have read that drama in its entirety. So as we are watching performance and talking about it, you're reading the next drama to get prepared for that point in the semester. That said, I know life isn't always ideal, so it might not be possible for you to read Oedipus the King in its entirety when the syllabus says we're beginning our discussions about Oedipus. But try your best. Understand that performance is in no way a substitute for reading, it's a supplement. The good news about Oedipus the King, as we will discuss, is that the audience already knew the plot before they watched the play. And we'll talk about the reasons why. That means that we need to know the plot before we actually watch the play. And that said, 430 BC, Greece, obviously we aren't reading the play in the original, so we're reading a translation. So it's always tricky when you're reading a translation of something. You're not going to get the exact wording. So that said, I've oftentimes said that I've never truly read Oedipus the King because I've never read it in the original Greek. I've read many English translations. So I say all of this to kind of caution you for our first play, Oedipus, that it's less of a word-for-word understanding and more of a holistic understanding of the play itself. And then after we're done discussing Oedipus and watching a performance, we will watch a performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream and also talk about Shakespearean language and a little bit about Shakespeare in general and why he's so important in the world of drama. And then finally, we'll end with A Raisin in the Sun. But all of that is for the future. Where we are now is trying to put some closure onto short story. So for today's attendance question, so this will be our last attendance question basically on the short story unit. This will be due on Thursday, the 23rd by noon. But as always, if you need an extension, please let me know. I thought that you could do a little bit of independent research. We've read quite a bit over the short story unit, but specifically we just finished up today with Jamaica Kincaid and Raymond Carver. So I ask you to choose one of those authors, whether it be Jamaica Kincaid or Raymond Carver, and briefly find some biographical information about that author that you think is applicable to their writing and to your understanding their work. And you're briefly indicating why you think that information that you found is important to understanding the author's writing. So I ask you to look up biographical information either about, it doesn't have to be both, either about Jamaica Kincaid or Raymond Carver, and briefly indicate how that information could be used to understand the author's writing. So you can spend as much or as little time as you like on this particular assignment. I understand that the temptation usually is to go on the internet and go on Google and find the first hit. I'm not averse to Google, but that's not necessarily the best way to find information. As you know, anybody can post anything on the internet, so we need to be very careful when we are citing things from the internet as to whether or not the information is accurate. I always suggest that you use your tuition dollars, which help to fund the GCC library, in particular, the library resources such as our databases. And the databases work much like online resources, but they are subscription based, so GCC's library pays for them. And the reason why they are subscription based is because they hire a staff to review the information before they post it. So there's a certain level of validity to and trust that you can have for information that you find on the database. And you can find that on the GCC library website. And as you probably know, that on the GCC website, regardless of what page you're on, the library is pretty prominent. It's hard to ignore. And while the library, of course, has resources like books and magazines and all of the traditional resources, it's usually those databases that individuals are interested in because, again, it gives you a wide range of information in a very easy, user-friendly format. And I think that that's much more trustworthy than going on the open web, especially because there are databases devoted to particular subject areas. So if you look at the databases, you can see that some of them are devoted just to literature and some of them are devoted just to biography. So that could help you with this particular assignment. That said, I'm not necessarily averse to you going onto the internet and finding information about either Jamaica Kincaid or Raymond Carver. Just make sure that the information is accurate. And again, more importantly, tell us how that biographical information can help inform our reading. Always with the caution that just because an author has a particular biography, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's directly reflected in their writing. There is that creative element. But I think when you look up information about Jamaica Kincaid or Raymond Carver, I think you'll find several elements of their lives that seem to make sense for our understanding the stories that we've read from them, at least for this particular class. So again, you can hand in your journal between any point from now until Thursday the 23rd at 11:59 p.m. via my email and PDF. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and I look forward to reading the information that you find about either Jamaica Kincaid or Raymond Carver. As you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. And that'll give you an idea of the kind of class discussion that we would have had about these two authors. Take care. Bye-bye.